Due to real estate boom, new high-rise buildings are coming up everywhere and there is a huge competition in this sector. In order to stay in this competition, the builders are hard-pressed to complete these buildings as early as possible. But dangerous fallout out of the lack of supervision, shoddy construction material and lack of structural audits has resulted in a series of fatal building accidents. Over 50% of fatalities reported from structural failings were linked to building collapses. If we were to take into account the apathy going into the maintenance and audit of other structures such as bridges and flyovers, the number of incidents is staggering. Data from the National Crime Records Bureau indicates that a total of 38,363 people lost their lives due to collapse of various structures between 2001 and 2015. It is expected that these figures could actually worsen.
What worries us is that buildings are collapsing because there is a laxity in the engineering of the buildings. You have this unauthorized colonization happening, large number of people illegally occupying lands, constructing buildings without municipal approvals and so on. So there are no engineers involved, no architects involved, buildings are not properly designed, buildings are not supervised. So it's a kind of a laissez-faire situation, and then construction just happens like that. People take money and then deliver something half-baked and go away. So buildings are bound to collapse.
Till when will India continue to ignore this real and ever increasingly pertinent risk as it affects human lives and endangers the construction industry? This week's India Risk Report looks at the failing building infrastructure of India.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India Risk Report. And in this episode, we are looking at the structural safety of urban infrastructure, particularly in the light of the fact that there are increasingly a number of accidents that are being reported of infrastructure collapsing or poorly built buildings falling on individuals and destroying the lives of many families. And while the country is on a ticking time bomb in terms of the infrastructural weaknesses that we see all around us, there seems to be very little immediate enforcement of the law or regulations which can ensure that the residents or the users of infrastructure could be in a far more comfortable position, particularly as more and more incidents are now being reported in urban areas, when in the past the experience was that these infrastructural damages were from old buildings in rural areas. But we have two experts who are going to help us understand that the risk that this poses both to individuals and to businesses. And we have with us once again on the show Professor V.K. Paul, who's the head of the Department of Building Engineering and Management at the School of Planning and Architecture. Welcome once again, sir, on the show. And we have with us Mr. Mittal, who's the structural engineer and member of the Code of Committees of the Bureau of Indian Standards, as well as a consultant and has his own business in the field of infrastructure and construction. So I'll start with you, Mr. Mittal. What do you think you'd like to put your finger on immediately? If I was to ask you to give me an answer in 1 minute, why is all this being reported now? Are all the buildings that are being reported are too old to be around and therefore they all seem to be falling at the same time?
No, I will put fingers on this is basically this is a design fault, a construction fault, implementation fault, as well as the poor quality fault. Basically, the whole gamut of construction engineering is at fault. And so it is not the old buildings which are falling, the new construction buildings are falling, and the regulation is not in place. So there is lapses on every part. Now buildings are becoming high tech. Now we have large high-rise buildings and large span buildings, so they are more likely to be damaged in case of structural failures. Earlier we used to have small buildings, low-rise buildings and low span buildings, so there were less chances of damages.
Okay, now while I concede that about 51.8% of India's territory is susceptible to earthquakes and earthquake related natural disasters, which in turn would see buildings fall. But to the credit of many a builders, and I live in one of those high rises, and I have faced in Gurgaon some experience over the last several years of earthquakes where I have been on the top floor and I have seen the building move, but barring aside minor cracks here and there, there has been no serious damage. I saw the fan and I saw the lights in my room shaking, but even then there was no serious crack. So there can be well implemented programs. But Professor Paul, sir, it is said that professors at the School of Architecture or architecture professors often tell students a joke that God is kind and concrete is strong, so go ahead and build. So therefore, it's all left to good concrete and to the will of God, and the necessary measures are not always incorporated. And also we have a limitation that we don't have very rigorous checks in place to ensure that the building is ready and in good condition for use. Now, is that a blanket approach that we can take while being critical of the buildings that have come up, or obviously it could vary from place to place?
Yes, you can take it as a blanket statement, but unfortunately God gave us very nice material called concrete, but we with our own non-professional approaches have ended up creating this beautiful material which can give us a life of about 60, 70, 80, 100 years. And today we are doing it in such a bad way in many cases that this beautiful material does not live even 10, 15 years, and we can see cracks and the way it is done. Unfortunately, the practice of using these materials is so bad that we are not able to get the required strength or the value of this material. While we may, in terms of academic input, we may say that this is a beautiful material, but when it comes to the implementation on site, unfortunately there are lots of loose and as you say, the quality assurance, quality control on site is very bad. And on top of that, we have the designs which are fundamentally flawed. So in those designs, even a good material will not work. So we have two things, the basic design failing in good principles and the quality controls and checks happening at the site. That's actually out of control.
Okay, so Mittal Saab, right, those are the things about design, quality controls, etc., etc. But as a consultant, what worries you? Or does it work in your favor that the building industry is unregulated?
No, building industry is highly unregulated, highly unorganized sector, and it is very worrisome for us consultant, because when we are designing any building or any structure, see, we are not sure whether the design we are providing will be implemented or not, whether quality control at site will be there or not. In case of any failure, knowingly or unknowingly, we will also be part of that that issue, that problem. So, being unregulated is not a good for any professional. It is a very troublesome thing for any professional. So, this sector needs to be regulated, and there is a very serious issue, and we are taking up this issue with the government for a long time, and I think government is not very serious about regulating this profession. This engineering profession is not regulated in our country. It's a very surprising thing.
Well, the New York Times apparently has said that often people lack the proper qualifications to build. Now, qualification is what schools like yours give out, and they say it is left into the hands of politicians, their relatives or associates to get on with the process of building, and which obviously leads to people pretending to be architects but not necessarily having an understanding of all the issues that are there in play. Now, is that a fair assessment?
You see, as far as architecture profession is concerned, it is regulated, the education is regulated under Architects Act of 1972. Unfortunately, the engineering profession is not regulated. So, if you are going to an engineer, if he is qualified through a defined framework of education, that's not very sure. Whereas as far as the architecture education is concerned, that's regulated under Architects Act. But the trouble here is that having done that, when it goes to the field, the other stakeholder who are the constructors, contractors, skilled people, or the suppliers who actually hands-on deliver it on ground, we have no control over that. So we may have project managers, but project managers work under the persons who give them money. That's a builder or a developer. So if builder and developer is not responsible, then they are in the hands of some wrong practices, and that's where the whole problem starts happening.
Quickly, Mr. Mittal, engineering and engineering qualifications are not regulated, or words to that effect. You come from that field, and you're also part of Bureau of Indian Standards for that. Do you accept that as one of the limitations?
So see, this is one of the very small part of the problem. This is a problem, yes, but this is one small part. See, it is very important to have a qualified, competent professionals working on the projects. So at present, we have a very good engineers. We also have bad engineers. We don't have any system which differentiates between the good and the bad engineer. So public at large is not aware who is a good engineer, who is a bad engineer. So this is a problem. So there needs to be an Engineers Act or Engineers Bill, or a regulatory body which regulates the profession of engineering, particularly those areas where public safety is at risk, like quality assurance and all those things, particularly in civil engineering. So this is very, very important, and government should take action on it very urgently. So this is one important thing. Now, but this is very small part of the whole problem. Another thing is building construction or flyover or highway, whatever you may say, number of agencies work on it. They are architects, they are engineers, they are civil engineers, site engineers, contractors, builders, PMCs, there are so many things, people are there. So qualification and competence of all those people are required. Further, the builders should also be regulated, but the RERA Act has come, but it is very small thing. I don't think it will resolve all the issues actually. So all these professions, including the contractors and builders, needs to be regulated. And as if you talk about the buildings or urban development, even the municipal corporations, the local bodies, since urban development, this is a local subject, it is a state subject, it is not a central subject. So it comes into the domain of various states. So ultimately, the municipal corporation, local body who sanctions and gives the completion certificate of these buildings must also be held responsible for all these things.
So there are obviously a lot of bodies that need to be held responsible and held accountable. But we are going to come back after a break to look at what kind of legal penalties should be imposed on bodies and individuals and companies that take on projects, and at the same time, what should be the regulatory mechanism that is ideal for India. But that after a break. Welcome back. We are looking at the various challenges that India faces in terms of urban infrastructure and the damages to building and its impact on the lives of individuals, and also on the threat to businesses, with buildings collapsing now more frequently in urban areas as against when they used to collapse in rural areas. And we have our two experts still with us. Professor Paulser, what do you think should be, and you talked earlier about the need for regulatory bodies. So what could be the regulatory overhaul that we need to look at, and some easily acceptable and implementable benchmarks that the government should consider putting into place to make a start at least, and add a clause that these will be reviewed every 2 years and improved upon?
Unfortunately, Maroof, that's not the case, because let's look at this problem in two parts. One is the urban areas which are within the some kind of a regulatory control mechanism, wherein DDAs, MCDs on these kind of statutory bodies, they regulate the construction, and you are required to get permissions, etc. There's a whole lot of other part of the city which is in so-called areas which are rural, urban villages or unregulated areas where no permissions are required. So even if they build on their own without looking at codes and standards, there's nothing we can do about it.
Yeah, in
because
fact, 56 years ago in Delhi, there were 110 unauthorized colonies.
Yes.
Today, they say where about 2,20,000 people lived.
Yeah.
And today, you have 1,797 unauthorized colonies. At least somebody has a count of the unauthorized colonies.
Yeah,
But I don't know what kind of people, numbers of people are living out there. And those colonies now have become sought after destination even for well-to-do people to go and have some kind of a house or a real estate construction in the hope that one day they'll get authorized.
you see, now in these areas, one is there's a motivation that, you have 4 times the price of the property across the road, and on this side you have 1/4. That's number one. Secondly, there's no control. You don't have to go to an architect or an engineer or go to anybody and do whatever you want to do. So you have all the motivation, and either you do bad construction because you want to do bad construction, or even if you want to do good construction, you may not actually have wherewithal, or you may resort not to access good professional advice. So my submission in this case is, whereas the majority of the city population which lives in these vulnerable places have possibility of reaching out in case of something goes wrong. Number 2, have some basic 2, 3, 4, 5 points which can be told to them, which can be kind of through awareness they can be brought about, that at least start doing this till such time we evolve some kind of a mechanism to advise them. Controlling is very, very far-fetched, because control mechanisms, even in our other control areas, haven't really been very successfully implemented. So if we have to do this, first I would say go for some advisory on fundamental or rational ways where few things can be told to them. So
that's where you come in, Mr. Mittal, as a consultant, that your advisories would help at least define that how do you deal with the impact of such disasters or the collapsing buildings, or when the colonies become fairly thriving areas of residence, but things are wrong, where you could either alert people to the dangers, because you see, I have seen with the government, they take extreme steps. As long as something is happening under their nose, they permit it. The moment it doesn't meet the agenda of the politicians or the bureaucrats, dozers land up out there and do away with buildings which are perfectly well made and decent, but they may not have followed the usual permission route which greases palms all the way up. So how do you deal with that?
See, I will, as Professor Pal said, see, we have two sides of the construction. One is where you need permissions and their regulatory mechanism can work and implementation should be good. That is the one thing. Where you have architect, engineers, everything is in place, just do the good implementation. And then the second part is where there is no need of illegal buildings or unauthorized construction is happening. So there, number one, we should have advisory kind of a thing. Yes, we can say this is a kind of a thing which you it is like a public awareness programs. We can say these are certain issues, basic guidelines which any building you are constructing, just keep in mind these things should be done. And this will depend upon the soil condition. This will also depend upon the zones, because some areas will be more earthquake prone zones, some will be flood prone zones, some areas will be cyclone affected areas. So depending upon soil conditions, topography and all those things, we can define these are the parameters which are the basic things which anyone should consider while constructing any building. Another thing, in unauthorized buildings in areas, at least we should have a limitation that any building should not go beyond this much of height, because these guidelines may work only for low rise buildings or 3-story, 2-3-story buildings. We can give those kind of a guidelines. But if you are going for multi-story buildings, 7-8-story buildings like happened in Greater Noida or in Ghaziabad, 7-story, 6-story building. So these guidelines actually will not work in those areas, in those type of buildings. But small 2-3 building residential buildings, yes, those kind of a guidelines parameters will work. So that we can do.
Here's just an add-on question. Do you think it makes sense to suggest the setting up of civilian watchdogs and bodies which may not have government's approval, but which work in all areas where small teams can alert the media to expose the excessive building that is taking place, which clearly looks unacceptable for that area because of the soil condition, because of the building laws that exist. So that I have found one area where the government tends to get fairly active is when the stuff comes on the front pages of a newspaper or a television channel.
Yes. Yes, that can work. That can work. But the problem.
Professor Paul, you have a view on that.
If I can intervene here, one is as a watchdog, but that comes second. First, let's not depend on the government all the time. Now, here at least the society professionals, they can pool in their own wherewithal and reach out to these people and make an effort to educate with some very fundamental few tips which are derived on strong engineering principles. That's like, pulse polio, 2 drops, but as a result of a lot of research. So you bring just 2, 3, 4, 5 basics, those tools, pass it on to the people, try to educate them, help them do
So
well.
how do you educate people who have paid for a building, entered into it, and now being told you're living on the 10th floor when only the building should have had 5 floors? So what does he do?
That's where the watchdog role will actually come in, where once you failed that and somebody does not listen, then you play the other role and then take them to the next level. But initial, assuming that anybody who's putting in money, he's a decent fellow and he doesn't want to go the wrong way. So at least take care of that lot of people. Then the ones who don't listen, then the other watchdog role can also be played. But then this is where the society has to come in, because government, as I mentioned, even in a regulated area we have difficulty in implementation, because the rate at which the proliferation is happening in built mass is far greater than the rate at which our capacity to regulate is strengthened. So somewhere we need to pull in our other mechanisms.
Yeah, actually population and our desperate need for urbanization is really at the heart of it all. And they are predicting, I think in another next 5-7 years, that our urban population will far exceed the rural population. And therefore the demand for more and more construction. And just give you a quick example, and I want your response to it, that in Chile there was regularly lots of earthquakes, but the Chilean government decided to learn from their mistakes and therefore went across enforcing strong building codes, and today the damage from earthquakes has been reduced dramatically. What stops us from doing that? Are we waiting for another Bhuj or Nepal to happen?
Yes, you are waiting. See, similar thing happened in California also. California is a very seismic prone area in the US. Now there is hardly any damage happens there in case of any earthquake. Same you see the Japan. But we have codes, we have BIS codes, we have even we have guidelines and provisions for earthquake resistant buildings, and for each new construction we take a certificate from an engineer that the structure building will be designed as per the BIS code and other codes, and it will be earthquake resistant. But whether it is being designed, it is being constructed, or nobody knows.
Yeah, that's unfortunately the tragedy of India. And educated people, companies, big organizations are also happy to get the certification done in a hurry without checking the basic standards, and also they all wait for governmental approval. Whether the government does come to the spot and give it an approval or not is another matter. And finally, the absence of watchdogs and public involvement in what is appearing to be increasingly a point of concern and possibilities of disaster cannot be averted unless we all get involved. Thank you very much for being with us on this show. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, goodbye.